All right, so in this video, we're going to get into UV mapping, right? Or UV unwrapping, okay? Basically, like, what is UV unwrapping? It's the way that we convert three-dimensional space into a flatland, into a two-dimensional space. And the reason that we do that is because when we texture things, textures are going to be represented in 2 dimensions, and we need to wrap them into 3 dimensions and apply them, right? And so UV mapping is sort of what that does, okay? So how do we convert a 3 dimensional object into a 2 dimensional object, right? Basically, I've created a little cardboard box here and an array of objects that I'm going to walk through, and I'm going to sort of explain how to do that. So think about a real world cardboard box, right? Have you ever seen a cardboard box when it's fully flattened, right? Before it's been assembled? That's sort of what we need to do, but in reverse, right? Does that make sense? So what we're going to do here is that if you imagine, for instance, if I were to unfold this cardboard box, I would do it something like this, right? I would take the top flaps up, cool. But then I can't just immediately unfold everything because that would squish it, right? So I sort of need to keep going. I need to sort of think, okay, well maybe now the sides would unfold down, right? Kind of like this. Oops, sorry, let me actually get all of my geometry there. The sides would unfold down, and then they would sort of be flat on the floor, right? Something like this, right? So that's essentially this side done. And then we would maybe, depending on whether or not this is a badly constructed cardboard box, we would probably repeat sort of the same thing on the other side, right? So this side would then rotate down and flatten, okay? And then lastly, we have these last sort of edges, right? So this would come up this way. This would come up this way. And then the flaps on the sides would just continue in the same fashion that we've already done them, right? They would just continue to rotate all the way down, like this. I'll just move this out of the way so we've got a little bit more space. And then these would also come down here, like this, right? Sorry, let me just turn my screencast keys on as well. Now lastly, because I haven't constructed this box very correctly, right, I put only one flap here, but we would assume that there would be sort of like multiple flaps on all sides of the box, kind of like this, right? These would also need to come down, okay? So they would come down like this, like that, and these would come down like that, right, roughly. And this is what the unfolded shape of that cardboard box, not any cardboard box, but that one in particular, would look like in 2 dimensions. And then if you could imagine that if this was a texture, we could then start texturing on this, and we would write, you know, blah, 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 shipping company, and, you know, these are the dimensions, and it's made out of corrugation 4, whatever. And then we would put brown, like, texture on it with some little wear marks on all the lines, and so on and so forth. But this is the idea, right? Is that we want to sort of unfold 3-dimensional objects down into 2-dimensional space, right? But that was a purpose-built object, so how does that really apply to the general case, right? So I'm going to do that again, but we're just going to do it with a cube, right? The way that we would sort of do this, if you could visualize, is again, we want to find a way to split the top seam open, right? And then the side coming down like this, right? This side would come down like this, and then these two would naturally fall down like this. Whoops, sorry, ignore that. Ignore that the mesh is falling apart. This is just for demonstration's sake. We would get a cross like this, right? Something like this, okay? Now, in fact, if I click up here to UV editing, and I click this, this is going to expose our UV editor. If I add a default cube here, and just hit tab to inspect its UVs, this is the shape we see. And you can see how it literally matches the 3-dimensional unfolding that we've done. Because it is a true analogy, right? We are flattening the object into 2-dimensional space, right? If I go up here on the very top left of the UV window and I click this little arrow, and I then in face select mode in the UV editor, I select one of our UV faces, you can see that that matches a corresponding face on the geometry, right? Because these are the same face, it's just that this is the 2-dimensional representation of these faces, this is the 3-dimensional, right? So technically, what are the button presses that we actually do to get this unwrap from scratch, right? Because I'm going to reset these actually. Blender gives us that unwrap by default, right? But what we would want to do is that instead of splitting the geometry and moving it around like I was doing before, we want to do that metaphorically, right? So if I select sort of an edge here and hit Control E, why are my screen sharing keys off? Sorry. They should be on. I wonder if the UV window is just sort of hiding that. If I select an edge and hit Control E, that brings up my edge menu, and I can click Mark Seam, right? Now, Mark Seam is going to basically color this in orange, and I want you to sort of think of this like a little cut line or a seam line, kind of as implied, right? That a pair of digital scissors are going to come across this and snip open, right? Now, if I was just to add that one seam line and hit U, followed by unwrap angle based, we get this, right? Because if you think about it, there's still no way to like open this object up. We haven't put enough cut lines in this to allow this geometry to actually open up and unfurl. So we would need another cut line, right? And following the logic of before, what I want to do here is create a flap of this top face, which hinges up on this edge. It hinges on this edge. So we want to seam on all of the other edges, right? Just ignore what I'm doing here. Cool. So I'll grab this edge and hit Control E, followed by Mark Seam. Now I'm going to select everything again, and I'm going to hit U, and we're going to see what happens, right? Okay, so this shape is a little bit different now, because what it's gone and done is Blender has said, you've given me enough information, enough seam lines, to allow me to mathematically unfold this top edge, but the rest of this is still bad. It's not, it has technically succeeded, right? But this is like an unworkable, you couldn't really texture on this, right? We're looking for this like nice flat uniform sort of shape, right? We need more seams to allow this to like open up more, right? So if I sort of repeat the process, I eventually want to result in this like cross sort of structure here. If I select this edge and hit Control E, Mark Seam, select everything, hit U, angle based unwrapping, we can see that now we've allowed Blender to open up this back edge, right? So instead of it being like these edges here where it's still joined, this edge has been split open, and we're starting to get more better usage like of our two-dimensional space, and it's becoming flatter, even though it's not fully flat just yet. So I'm going to continue that seam down here, and again, I want to create a hinge on this edge, right? I'll just demonstrate that hinge again. I want this to hinge out like this, so that means that every other face I need a seam on except this one. So I'm going to leave that one there, mark a seam, select everything, U, angle-based unwrap. And now we see we've got our two faces like isolated now. And we're just going to repeat this process again, right? So it's going to be the exact same side for the other side. Exact same seams, sorry, on the other side. Mark seam, unwrap everything. And now we've got our cube. So why did our cube just sort of naturally finish? Well, let's think about this, right? We have one hinge here. Sorry, give me a second. We have this hinge here. We have this hinge here. And by virtue of us starting on this top edge, right? Well, we actually indirectly also added the hinge to the back side as well. So what that means is that this can now fold out, and this can fold out. Boom. And we have our unwrap, right? So that's really it. That's about as complicated as it gets. There's a lot more to unwrapping, right? But like it is basically just that process done 1,000 times in slightly different ways, right? So I'm just going to run through these like shapes and just give you sort of an explanation for them. The rectangle, like a long rectangle, is the exact same thing again. It's just a long cube, right? So I'm going to split the top off, leaving one behind. I'm going to split the sides off, or mark seams on the sides, leaving a hinge. You know, split the sides, leaving another hinge. And now we're all good. Boom, right? So do you see how it's functionally sort of the exact same thing as the cube, but like longer in a couple dimensions, right? Now with the cylinder, it's very similar as well, right? I'm going to mark basically the entire top except for one edge, and this is not a good unwrap, mind you. I'm just going to communicate the process. Mark the entire top edge cut, because when you think about it, this is like the top edge of our cube, right? The top face. It's basically the same thing. So I'm going to open that up from that one side, And I'm going to do the same here as well. Open that up from the bottom. Now, like with our cube, we would typically need to add a couple seams back here, but because this is a cylinder, it's like a perfectly rounded cube. We only need one seam, right? So I'm just going to put that at the back. Mark seam, select everything, unwrap. So you can see how on cylinders are basically cubes on easy mode, right? Like we mark one seam down the long axis and that allows the cube to unfurl. Now normally you probably wouldn't necessarily leave a hinge here to keep these two together. Like you can, but you don't really have to, right? Most people would instead completely chop the top off and then position the caps somewhere else on the texture space, right? Slight little nuance there, but you know, it's not like the end of the world, you know? Okay, so now let's think about the cone, right? A cone is just like a cylinder, but with one of the tops being really small, right? So small, in fact, that it's a point. So we do the same thing again. We mark the bottom with a seam. You can leave a little hinge here. I personally don't, but, you know, it's not the end of the world if you do. Because what I want you to do is think about this conceptually like a cube, right? The cube has the bottom face, right, which is here. We create a hinge. We unfold the cube. The top face, we would do the same as well, but on a cone, we get that for free because there's nothing here, right? And then on the side, we would want to mark a seam and then unwrap. And that allows our cube to like unfurl, right? That basically, it's this balancing act between not putting too much distortion in the two-dimensional space, because if you think about like a globe or a sphere, there's really no elegant way to convert a sphere into a series of circles, right? So there's always going to be some level of distortion, and we have to sort of make judgment calls as to that amount of distortion. So this changes slightly, right? When we think of a really shallow cone, right? Repeating what we've learned, we mark the bottom as a seam, and then we pick one major edge. We mark that as a seam, and then we unwrap. See how, like, you know, we've opened this up, but this is still just mostly sort of a circle, right? It's mostly sort of the same shape. So in the case of a shallow cone, right, something flat with minimal distortion, we sort of make a judgment call. We don't need this seam. We can get rid of this seam and then unwrap it again. And now it just makes two very neat, very nice, like shapes, right? Okay, so we've chosen to put a little bit of distortion in this in exchange for not having that seam, because if there is a seam, it could be hard to texture paint across this, right? Like if I want to do some sort of like elegant pattern here and I paint to this edge, I have to make sure that it lines up on that edge, and it's pretty much always going to create some sort of visible gap between the two, right? No matter how good I am at texturing, there's probably going to be some sort of visible gap. So in the case like this, we just wouldn't bother with the seam, right, on this object, okay? So following the logic, right, of like a cube, we can apply basically the same idea to any shape, right? Just thinking about it like a cube and how to sort of like unfold that cube, right? Kind of, sort of like that, and then the sides could come off, right? So if I'm going to think in a cube-like way for this, well, I know that cylinders are mostly cubes. So I'm going to sort of treat this as like a large sort of like cylinder. Now, on the cylinder, we have essentially one seam at the back, right? So if I try and unwrap the face, I click this, it's going to be really, like technically it's going to work, but you can see how the all of like the majority of this two-dimensional space is sort of devoted to like the neck, and the face actually gets smushed all the way down in here. This will technically work, but this is a garbage unwrap because it's like wasting so much space, and it's concentrating all of the geometry down into this little tiny area. So you get like, you know, 5 or 6 pixels for the eyes, but then like 100 pixels for the neck, right? That's really not what we want. So if I find my middle line, which this is an asymmetric model, so it's going to be a little difficult, but I'm pretty sure it's this one here. Yeah, that topology is not perfect there, actually. But it's this line here. This is my middle line going all the way up and down. I'm going to start sort of snipping this one from the back, and I'm going to progressively unwrap and show you what's going to happen, right? See how we've snipped that one there? It's allowing it to unfold, which is letting the geometry sort of naturally smooth out and issue like more texture space, more unwrap space to the surfaces that generally need it, right? So if I keep snipping this open, I'll kind of bring it all the way up to like here. Whoops, sorry. to about here. Then unwrap again. And so see how now that I'm doing that, this central area is actually getting more resolution, and it's relaxing enough that the bottom edges are getting less resolution, right? I'm going to save us some time, and I'm just going to continue this all the way down to, where do we want? I think here. Sorry, I'll explain what I'm looking for in a second, but about there, right? Now I'm going to mark seam, and I'm going to unwrap again, okay? So now we're starting to really get into good territory, right? This is actually a really decently texturable face, right? And all we did was we added one seam up the back. And the reason we put it on the back is like, how often do you look at the back of someone's head in a video game? It's usually almost always the front, or potentially the back of a helmet that's covering the back of the head, right? So that's another key thing, is that we're trying to place seams in places that aren't super noticeable, because they're always going to impart a little bit of disruption to the texture along that line. So we want to try and hide it a little bit, right? Now I can feel, like by instinct, that there's still a lot of tension, like in this unwrap, but there's a better way of actually seeing that by going up here, I think, and then we want to look at UV stretch. And we can see that certain areas of this are stretching a little bit, but this is actually a remarkably relaxed unwrap. Basically all blue sort of means like good to go, roughly, you know? There's always going to be some level of distortion from 3D into 2D. You can't always like prevent it, but you know, in general, just look for mostly blue. That's kind of what you're after, right? I would mostly finish a lot of my unwraps off by grabbing the character's hairline and bringing it down to these poles that I've made, down here to this pole, and then marking that as a seam, and then trying the unwrap again, right? That's just going to allow the top to kind of open up a bit and just like further reduce distortion. It was actually interesting in that there wasn't really much distortion that would warrant potentially this seam on this model. So, you know, even on this model, we could get rid of that. But what I want to stress is that really with only like 1 and 2 seams, we've unwrapped a relatively complex shape, because really when we think about it, that face is really just kind of like a long rounded cube, right? That's kind of like functionally what that face really is, right? And we can see here on that long rounded cube, it's the sort of same thing. We have sort of these poles on the left and the right representing the character's hairline, and then we have a large like seam going down the back of the head down to here. And on my model in particular, there's an open boundary at the neck, so we would just get rid of all this, right? Just for the sake of demonstration. Cool, get rid of all of that. This shape, which again is just a cube, which has been smoothed into the shape of a sphere and then stretched. This is sort of what I mean by like everything comes back to squares, right? Everything comes back to cubes, really. This here is functionally an incredibly similar unwrap to this. It's basically the same. It's just that this one on the left has a lot more like information. And if I unwrap this, angle-based unwrap, we see a very similar shape start to arise. Very similar, right? So that's how I want you thinking about these sorts of things. I suppose if I was going to do sort of the true cube analogy, we could treat this top area here like that top face of the cube, and allow that to sort of hinge open at the hairline. This is also not necessarily the worst way in the world to unwrap stuff. I'm pretty sure everyone in film is going to disagree with me there, but that's fine. But, you know, it's sort of the same idea, right? We want to minimize the number of seams that we can get away with, while minimizing the amount of stretch and maximizing the space that these islands take up in this square, because this square is going to dictate sort of the maximum amount of like texture that we can allocate, non-tiling texture that we can allocate to these meshes, right? So that's essentially the process for unwrapping, and I'll recap really quick, right? Unwrapping is the process of converting 3-dimensional space down into 2-dimensional space for the purposes of texturing. We do that from our UV editing window by clicking up here, going Layout and UV Editing. Another thing you could do is right-click here and vertically split your viewport and then swap over to the UV editor, right? But a lot of people just prefer to click up here to UV Editing. We do our UV seam placement with our edges. This is edge data. We're selecting edges and we're hitting Control E and we're assigning seams. And you can clear seams here as well if you make a mistake, right? Once you've assigned seams, or during the process of assigning seams, you can select all of your geometry, hit U, and then select an unwrap method. Just stick with angle based for now. All of these other ones are useful for different things, but just stick with this here now, right? And you just do that again and again, conceptually in your mind, thinking about everything as a cube, right? If we think about the arms coming off of the character, well, that's just a smoothed cube. It's just a tube. And then the fingers coming off of the hand, that's also a tube, right? Eventually, you'll learn a sort of a better way of unwrapping those particular shapes, but that's basically how you can conceptualize everything, right? We want to minimize the amount of seams, while conversely having enough seams to minimize distortion, right? And we can view our distortion in the UV window. If we scroll across to here, to this like display menu, we can go down and see UV stretch by angle or by area. Both of these are important, right? And you want roughly as little of both, but you'll never be able to perfectly get either to be minimized. It's always a trade-off, right? So keep that in mind, okay? That's basically the intro to unwrapping. There are other things to it, but that's really where you want to start thinking about this just for now.